There is a particular kind of quiet that settles over a person who has decided, finally, to stop waiting for someone to notice what they built. It is not the quiet of peace. It is not the quiet of acceptance. It is the quiet of a person who has learned, the hard way, that the only witness they were ever going to get was themselves, and who has decided, somewhere deep and cold and deliberate, that this time the record will be set straight. Morgan Vance made that decision on a Tuesday morning in early October, standing at the window of a ninth-floor apartment that smelled like old espresso and something faintly floral from the building across the street. The city below was still moving the way it always moved, unhurried, certain of itself, indifferent to individual reckoning. Morgan watched a delivery truck pull into the narrow alley between two buildings and thought about 7 years. 7 years of arriving first and leaving last. 7 years of writing the documents that others would sign. 7 years of solving the problems before anyone knew there was a problem. And the thought that arrived with the coffee cooling in both hands was clean and quiet and final. It was time. Not for anger. Morgan had already moved through anger, the way a person moves through a room in a burning building, fast, not stopping to touch anything. It was time for something much slower. Something that couldn't be denied, dismissed, reframed, or absorbed. Something that would simply exist, in the open, for anyone with working eyes. It was time to let the truth take up the space it had always deserved. Morgan turned away from the window and set the coffee down, opened a laptop, and began. The name of the company was Ardwell Creative Systems. It was not large, never more than 42 people at its peak, operating out of a converted loft in a neighborhood that had once been a garment district and was now the kind of place where exposed ductwork cost extra. The kind of company where everyone knew what everyone else was working on, where the founders ate lunch together every Thursday, where a single team could, and frequently did, decide the direction of the entire organization over a 30-minute conversation that nobody wrote down. That intimacy was its greatest asset. It was also the reason the lies had grown so easily, so naturally, threaded through the warmth the way a vine threads through a garden wall, until you can no longer see the stone. Morgan had joined Ardwell 7 years ago, brought in as a senior strategist just as the company was beginning to outgrow its original vision. The three founders, Petra Calloway, James Holt, and a third person who had left before Morgan arrived and whose name had been gradually removed from the hallway photos, had built something genuine in those early years. Small, careful work, independent brands with actual values, a reputation for doing things the right way, even when it cost something. But the company's center of gravity had been shifting for 3 years before Morgan understood that the shift had a name, and the name was James. The first thing Morgan ever noticed about James Holt was the way he listened. Not the way most people listened, waiting for the space to speak, but the way a person listens when they are genuinely interested in what you are saying, when the machinery of their attention is fully engaged, when you feel, for the duration of that conversation, like the most important person in the room. It was a gift. Later, Morgan would understand it as a skill, carefully practiced and strategically deployed. But at the beginning, it felt like being seen. That first meeting was about the Sandoval account, a mid-size outdoor gear brand out of New Mexico, family-owned, founder still in the building every day. The kind of client that required care. Morgan had spent 3 weeks developing a positioning framework that threaded their environmental commitments with a new consumer segment they hadn't considered before. It was good work. Morgan knew it was good work, the way you know something true without needing confirmation, from the inside, before the outside has spoken. James had sat across the conference table and listened for 40 minutes without interrupting, and then he had said, very quietly, "This is exactly what this company needs right now." Not the client, the company. Morgan had filed that away. It had seemed like a compliment. It had seemed, in fact, like exactly the kind of recognition that makes a person want to give more. 7 years later, Morgan understood precisely what it had meant. The habit had started in the 3rd month. Small things at first, a phrase from Morgan's brief appearing in James's presentation to the board without attribution. A recommendation Morgan had written for the Sandoval brand used verbatim in a pitch deck for a different client, under James's name. Nothing you could point to cleanly. Nothing you could bring to someone and say, "Look, this is mine, it was taken." The evidence was soft. The context was muddy. The company culture prized collaboration over individual credit, which was a beautiful value until it became a mechanism for erasure. Morgan had mentioned it once, carefully, to Petra Calloway. Petra had looked genuinely troubled by the conversation, had said she would speak with James, had touched Morgan's forearm with a warm hand, and said the words that good-hearted people say when they want the uncomfortable thing to go away. "I know how much your work means here. Everyone knows." The attribution issue had not come up again. The work had continued to migrate. What Morgan could not have known then, and would not discover until much later, until the machinery of patient reckoning was already well in motion, was why Petra had not pushed harder. What Petra was protecting. The secret that had lived inside the architecture of Ardwell for years before Morgan had ever walked through the door. But that is a later chapter. The second thing Morgan noticed about James Holt was smaller than the first, and it took longer to surface. It was something about the way he moved through the company's culture, like a person who understood the emotional weather of any room before they walked into it, who knew intuitively which relationships were load-bearing and which were decorative, who said the right thing at the right moment in a way that made people feel grateful rather than managed. It was not manipulation, exactly. Not at first. Morgan genuinely believed, for years, that James was simply a perceptive person who happened to be very good at people. The slow erosion is always like that. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't arrive with a face you can name. It comes in increments, each one small enough to dismiss, adding up across years to something that would have horrified you if you had seen it whole on the first day. James had been good once. Morgan was nearly certain of this. The early work, the projects before Morgan's arrival, the archived decisions, the culture Petra still talked about in the past tense with a kind of helpless nostalgia. That work had been honest. James's instincts had once been about the thing itself, the brand, the problem, the client, the truth. At some point, the instincts had quietly rerouted. The target had shifted from the work to the recognition of the work. And the two things looked identical from the outside for a very long time. The first time Morgan understood what was actually happening was not a dramatic moment. There was no document left open on a shared screen, no overheard conversation in a hallway. It was a Tuesday afternoon. Tuesdays, Morgan had noticed, carried a particular weight in this story. When a new hire named Reyes mentioned, in passing, that the strategic framework for the Lundgren account was James's original methodology. Morgan had been standing at the coffee station in the open kitchen when Reyes said this. It was a throwaway line in a larger conversation about the Lundgren brand's history at the company. Reyes was new. Reyes had read the internal documentation, the project retrospectives, the attribution lines in the company's knowledge management system, all of which listed James Holt. Morgan had set down the coffee. Not because of the shock. The shock was muted, familiar. The way you feel when a thing you have suspected becomes a thing you have confirmed. But because of the particular quality of that moment, the understanding that this was not a series of accidents, that the documentation had not attributed James by oversight. Someone had arranged the documentation that way. The coffee station smelled faintly of burnt grounds and whatever was growing in the small succulents by the window. These were the details Morgan's brain recorded, while the rest of it reorganized the last 7 years into their correct shape. The walk back to the desk was very quiet. The second cup of coffee stayed untouched for the rest of the afternoon. What Morgan did next was not dramatic, either. That was the thing about patience as a practice. It required you to resist the drama, to understand that the moment you reveal what you know, you are handing the other person the chance to shape the narrative. And Morgan, who had spent 7 years watching narratives be shaped by someone who was very, very good at it, had no interest in giving that chance away. Instead, Morgan started keeping a record. It began as a habit that had already existed in a different form. Morgan had always been meticulous about documentation, about keeping personal copies of early drafts, about dating files and noting their origins. This was not paranoia. It was simply the practice of someone who valued precision, who believed that the accurate record of how a thing came to be was itself a kind of truth worth preserving. Now that habit became something else, something with direction. Every piece of work got time-stamped. Every internal email that traced an idea back to its origin was saved into a folder that lived on a personal drive, not the company server. Every version history that showed a document's evolution, from Morgan's initial draft to the final version bearing a different name, was preserved with careful notes. It took 2 months before Morgan found the first unambiguous piece: the Callaway retail pitch. One of the largest accounts Ardwell had pursued in its history. A national chain with a complex brand identity problem and a budget that would have changed the company's financial position for 2 years. Morgan had written the strategic architecture for that pitch over 6 weeks. Not the creative direction, that was Petra's team, but the underlying thinking, the market analysis, the positioning thesis, the competitive reframe that turned a liability into the brand's sharpest differentiating story. The final pitch deck, presented by James to the Callaway board, credited the strategic framework to James Holt, senior partner, who had developed a proprietary methodology for legacy brand repositioning. Morgan had the drafts, dated, with revision notes. The earliest file was time-stamped 4 days before James had even been looped into the Callaway project. That was the moment the record-keeping became an architecture. Over the following 5 months, Morgan built quietly, not conspicuously, not in a way that changed anything visible about the day-to-day work at Ardwell. The morning coffee still appeared at the desk at 8:15. The strategy documents still went out under the collaborative process that the company culture celebrated. The conversations in the kitchen were still warm, still genuine, still the texture of a place where people mostly liked each other. But underneath, file by file, conversation by conversation, noted and dated and cross-referenced, a different kind of structure was taking shape. One that showed, with the patience of careful chronology, exactly what had been taken, exactly when it had been taken, and exactly where it had gone. Morgan met with Petra Callaway on a Wednesday morning in the 5th month. It was ostensibly about the Mercer account, a mid-size cosmetics brand with an identity crisis and a founder who changed her mind every 3 weeks. Over the course of that conversation, Morgan said, in a tone of complete neutrality, "I've been thinking about how we document the origin of strategic work on shared accounts. I'd love to propose a new process." Petra had looked up from her notebook. Something had moved across her face. Not quite recognition, not quite discomfort, something in between, like a person who feels the edge of a room they do not want to enter. "That sounds useful," Petra had said. "I'll write something up," Morgan had said, and had. The proposed documentation process was reasonable, methodical, and completely unthreatening. It asked for nothing dramatic, simply a time-stamped brief at the beginning of each project, signed by the originating strategist, and a clear contribution log maintained throughout. Standard practice at agencies twice Ardwell's size. The kind of process that existed everywhere, except places where its absence served a specific purpose. James had read the proposal and said, in the meeting where it was discussed, that it was a great idea and that he had been thinking about something similar for years. The proposal had been tabled pending further discussion and had not been mentioned again. Morgan had written down the date of that meeting. It was around this time that Morgan began to understand that the situation was larger than it appeared. That the question was not simply whether James had taken credit for work that belonged to someone else. That question was almost too small for what the record was revealing. The larger question, the one that arrived on a Thursday evening when Morgan was reading through a file of early company documents that Petra had shared 3 years ago for an internal retrospective project, was whether the entire shape of Ardwell's current reputation had been built deliberately on a fiction. The strategic work that had made James Holt's name in the industry, the work that had been written about in 2 trade publications, cited in a design school case study, mentioned in a podcast interview James had done 18 months ago, that work had, in almost every significant case, originated with someone else. In some cases, it had originated with Morgan. In other cases, the names on the original drafts belonged to people who had left the company. Some of them quietly, with carefully worded parting statements. Some of them less quietly, in ways that had been absorbed into the company's narrative as personality conflicts or cultural mismatches, or the natural attrition of a growing organization. One of them, a person named Corinne Ahern, who had been Ardwell's first dedicated strategist before Morgan's arrival, who had left abruptly at the end of her 3rd year, had written something in a farewell email that had been forwarded to Morgan once, as context, in the middle of a conversation about something else. Morgan had read it quickly, filed it vaguely, moved on. It had not seemed significant at the time. Now, reading it again in the quiet of a Thursday evening, it seemed like the clearest statement of the situation Morgan had ever encountered. Corinne had written, "I hope the work finds its way home someday." Morgan sat with that sentence for a long time. The work finding its way home was exactly what was happening, just slowly, just carefully, in a way that could not be undone by a reframing or a generous interpretation or a well-timed conversation in a warm kitchen. The thing that changed the nature of the architecture, the thing that moved it from a careful record into something with real structural weight, arrived in the 6th month from a direction Morgan had not anticipated. His name was Dominic Pera. He had been Ardwell's account director for the Holt Group portfolio, an unrelated company, confusingly named, a construction holding firm that had been one of Ardwell's most significant clients for 4 years. Dominic was meticulous, slightly formal, the kind of person who remembered everything and referenced nothing without reason. They had worked together closely on the Holt Group account for 2 years without ever having a conversation that was not entirely professional. And then, one Tuesday, Tuesdays again, the weight of Tuesdays in this story, Dominic had appeared at Morgan's desk with a specific look on his face and a coffee that he set down without being asked. "I want to show you something," he said. What Dominic showed Morgan was a series of email threads, external correspondence between Ardwell's account management team and the Holt Group that had been archived in a shared drive Morgan had never had reason to access. The threads were from 2 years ago and involved the final presentation of a major repositioning strategy for the Holt Group's residential arm. The strategy was Morgan's. Morgan recognized it immediately. Not just the ideas, but the specific language, the structural choices, the particular sequence of the argument. It was like reading your own handwriting in someone else's notebook. The credit given to the client, in writing, in official correspondence, was James Holt's. This was different from internal documentation. This was external. This was a client who had paid for a service and had been told in writing who had delivered it. "How long have you known?" Morgan asked. Dominic looked at the coffee he had brought. "I started putting it together about a year ago. I didn't know what to do with it." "Why are you doing something with it now?" Dominic was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Because I think you're doing something with it. And I think whatever you're doing should have this." Morgan looked at the email threads for a long time. "I need copies." "I already made them," Dominic said. The architecture now had a second pillar. The month that followed was the most demanding of the process, not because anything dramatic happened, but because nothing did. The record was nearly complete. The structure was solid. What remained was timing, and timing required patience of a different kind than documentation did. Documentation was meticulous. Timing required something closer to stillness. The willingness to wait until the moment was exactly right, until the thing would land where it needed to land and could not be quietly absorbed. Morgan identified 3 target audiences. The first was Ardwell's board, a 4-person oversight structure that met quarterly and had been largely passive, deferring to the founders on operational matters. The second was the trade press, specifically the 2 publications that had covered James's work most extensively and whose editors Morgan had met at conferences over the years. The third was Corinne Ahern. Tracking down Corinne had been easier than expected. She had her own practice now, small, independent, a deliberately quiet operation that had no social media presence, and a website that was essentially a contact form. She was doing exactly the kind of careful, values-led work that Ardwell had once been known for. When Morgan emailed her, she responded in 2 hours. Their first conversation lasted 4 hours. Corinne had not kept documentation in the same way. She had not anticipated needing to. But she had something Morgan did not: memory, specific and detailed, of conversations that had occurred before the patterns had been normalized. She remembered the first time she had seen her work appear under a different name. She remembered the exact wording of the explanation she had been given. She remembered, most importantly, what had been said to her in her exit conversation, what had been implied, what had been offered in exchange for a certain kind of departure. "He told me that the company would speak well of me if I left quietly," Corinne said, "and that if I made noise, the narrative would be very different." "Did you believe him?" "I believed that he was capable of it," Corinne said, "and I didn't have the energy to find out." There was a long pause on the call. "I have the energy now," Corinne said, "if you need it." Morgan's hand, holding the phone, was very steady. "I need it," Morgan said. The moment that most people would have identified as the crisis arrived in the 8th month, 4 weeks before the architecture was fully ready to deploy. It arrived, as such moments often do, in the form of something that was meant to foreclose the possibility of a reckoning before it could happen. James Holt offered Morgan a promotion. It was presented as recognition, as the company's acknowledgement of years of exceptional contribution. A new title, Chief Strategy Officer, newly created, with a corresponding salary increase and a seat at the leadership table. The offer was made privately in James's office, with the door closed, with a warmth and apparent sincerity that Morgan had once found compelling. "You've been the intellectual backbone of this company for years," James said. "Everyone knows it." The sentence landed with a precision that James almost certainly did not intend. Morgan had spent 7 years listening to variations of that sentence. "Everyone knows it. Your work matters here. We all recognize what you bring." And understanding, with increasing clarity, that the function of the sentence was not acknowledgement, but management. That the purpose of saying "everyone knows" was to prevent the person from asking, "Then why doesn't the record show it?" Morgan looked at James Holt, sitting across his desk, and thought about Corinne's phrase, "the work finding its way home," and thought about Dominic's face when he had set down the coffee, and thought about the folder on the personal drive, dated and organized and waiting. "I'd like to think about it," Morgan said. "Of course," James said. "Take your time." The smile that followed was genuine. That was the part Morgan found most difficult, even at this late stage, the genuineness of it. James was not performing warmth. He felt it. He had always felt it. The erosion had not made him a cold person. It had made him a warm person who had done cold things and had, over years, found ways to feel good about that. The offer was not a gesture of recognition. Morgan understood this clearly. It was insurance, a new title, a new seat at the table, and the accompanying sense of investment in the company's structure. These were the things that made a person less likely to burn the structure down. Morgan drove home that evening on a route that went past the edge of the park. It was late enough that the park was mostly empty, the lights along the path making small yellow islands in the dark. There was a bench near the north entrance that Morgan had sat on a handful of times over the years, usually at the end of difficult days. Not to think, just to be somewhere that was not the office and not yet home. Tonight was not one of those nights. Tonight, the thinking was done. Morgan drove past the bench without stopping. The offer was declined, by email, the following morning. The email cited a desire to remain in an individual contributor role for the foreseeable future. It was polite. It was professional. It was everything a person would write if they were declining an offer because they simply valued their current work. James responded with warmth and said the door was open whenever Morgan was ready. Morgan archived the response. 3 weeks later, Morgan sent a package. Not a single document, not a complaint or an accusation or a demand. A package, in the most precise sense, a curated, organized, cross-referenced set of materials, drafts and final versions, timestamps and revision histories, email threads and correspondence, Corinne's written statement, and Dominic's archived emails, that together told a story any reader could follow without guidance, organized the way a skilled strategist organizes a brief, clearly, without drama, with the evidence doing all the necessary work. The package went to 3 people simultaneously. The first was Ardwell's board chair, a woman named Elsa Mord, who had been on the board since the company's 2nd year and whose reputation for ethical governance was the only reason Morgan had any confidence in the process at all. The second was the editor of the trade publication that had published the most significant profile of James's work, a piece that had named 3 specific strategic projects and credited them entirely to him. The third was Petra Calloway. It was this last one that required the most thought. Morgan had spent weeks deciding whether to include Petra. Petra, who had touched Morgan's arm and said, "Everyone knows." Petra, who had received Corinne's concerns and not pushed harder. Petra, who had been for 7 years the company's visible conscience, the founder who still cared about the original vision, who still used words like integrity and craft without any apparent irony. What Morgan had not known, and what Dominic had found in the archived correspondence while building the documentation package, was the thing that changed the meaning of Petra's silence. James Holt had not built the pattern alone. In the earliest years of the company, before Morgan, before Corinne, before anyone who could now speak to the pattern, there had been a crisis. Not a public one, not a dramatic one, a quiet one. Of the kind that small companies sometimes face when the books tell a different story than the reputation. Ardwell had been near collapse. The details were in a set of financial documents that Dominic had located in an archive folder that should have been deleted years ago and had been kept inexplicably in a subdirectory of the company's original file structure. James had saved the company, not with his work, but with his connections. A specific set of relationships that had brought in a rescue investment and 2 significant accounts at the moment when the company needed both. The rescue had been real, and it had been genuinely important, but the investment had come with a condition that had never been disclosed to anyone outside the 3 founders. The condition was that James Holt's name and reputation would be the public face of Ardwell's strategic ability. Not because he was the most capable strategist, The records made clear that he was not, had never been, that Corinne and later Morgan were the genuine sources of the methodology that had made the company's reputation. But because the investor had backed James specifically, had known James, had needed James to be the story, Petra had agreed to this. Petra had known, from the beginning, what the arrangement required. She had lived with it because the company had survived because of it, and because she had told herself, over years, that the work mattered more than the attribution, and that everyone who really knew the company knew the truth. This was what the protected secret had always been. Not James's ambition, not the theft exactly. The original arrangement. The structural decision made under pressure in a moment when the alternative had been the end of everything. Petra had not orchestrated the erasure, but she had known it was happening, and she had decided, repeatedly, to let it continue, because the foundation of the company's existence was bound up in the story that made James Holt necessary. Morgan sat with this for a long time before deciding what to do with it. The easy thing would have been to make Petra a co-defendant in the narrative, to include the investor correspondence in the package, and let the full complexity land all at once. There was a version of the architecture that took the whole structure down, that looked at everything that had been built on a false foundation and said, all of it should come down. Morgan had chosen not to do that version. Not out of mercy exactly, out of precision. The thing that needed to come into the light was the attribution, the pattern of erasure, the rewriting of history that had disadvantaged not just Morgan, but Corinne and others whose names the record had absorbed. Petra's culpability was real, but it was a different shape. The shape of a person who had made a bad decision under duress and had spent years justifying it to themselves. The justice that was relevant here was not the justice that destroyed Petra. It was the justice that made the record accurate. The package, as it was sent, noted Petra's awareness of the attribution issues without characterizing them as malice. It did not include the investor correspondence. That decision, Morgan had written in a private document that lived only on the personal drive, was subject to revision if Petra's response to the package proved dishonest. Petra's response was not dishonest. She called Morgan at 8 in the morning, the day after the package was sent. She called on a personal number, not an office line, and she was crying before she finished the first sentence. "I knew," she said. "I told myself it wasn't. I told myself the work was what mattered." "I know," Morgan said. There was a long silence. "What are you going to do?" Petra asked. "Exactly what the package describes," Morgan said. "No more, no less." Another silence. Morgan could hear Petra breathing, trying to steady herself. "I should have stopped it years ago," Petra said. "Yes," Morgan said. "I'm sorry." Morgan did not tell Petra that the apology changed anything. It did not change the record. It did not change what Corinne had carried. It did not change what had been taken. But it was real, and Morgan chose to let it be real without needing it to be more than it was. "If the board asks you for your account," Morgan said, "tell them the truth." "I will," Petra said. Morgan believed her. The board convened an emergency session 9 days after the package was received. Morgan was not present at that session. Neither was James. The session was conducted by Elsa Mard with 2 outside advisors and lasted most of a day. The trade publication's response was slower but inevitable. The editor had called Morgan 2 days after the package arrived, asking questions that were careful and professional. The questions of someone who understood both the significance and the responsibility of what they had been given. Morgan had answered clearly and completely, and had directed the editor to Corinne for a separate statement. The story that eventually ran was not sensational. It did not use language like fraud or theft. It used words like misattribution and professional ethics and the importance of accurate credit in collaborative industries. It was measured, evidenced, and thorough. It ran 8 weeks after the package was sent, on a Thursday morning. Morgan read it at the window of the 9th-floor apartment, with coffee in the early light. The city below was already moving. The delivery truck was making its way through the alley again, or one very like it. A pigeon landed on the windowsill and regarded Morgan for a moment, with the flat incuriosity of a creature that has witnessed everything and remembered nothing. The story said in its 3rd paragraph, "The strategic frameworks that defined Ardwell's critical period are now understood to have originated principally with 2 strategists whose contributions were not accurately reflected in company documentation or public communications." 2 strategists. Morgan and Corinne. Their names were in the sentence. Their names were in the record. The work had found its way home. James Holt resigned from Ardwell Creative Systems 12 days after the board session. The resignation statement was brief, expressing gratitude for the opportunity and wishing the company well. It did not address the attribution findings. It was the statement of a person who understood that the only move available was to leave before the full weight of what had been documented became the entire story. Morgan read the resignation statement once and did not keep a copy. The thing that happened after, the thing that was smaller and quieter and in some ways harder than everything that had preceded it, was that Ardwell continued. The company did not collapse. The accounts did not evaporate. The work that had been done was still good work, regardless of how the credit had been arranged, and the clients who had received it still valued it. Petra, to her credit, did not attempt to rebuild the narrative in James's absence. She called a meeting of the full company and said, clearly and without qualification, that strategic attribution practices at Ardwell had not met the standard she expected of the company, that this was being corrected, and that going forward, the record would accurately reflect individual contributions. She did not elaborate on the history. She did not publicly name Morgan or Corinne or James, but she said the thing that needed to be said in front of the full company, in the loft with the exposed ductwork and the small succulent by the coffee station. Reyes, who had started the chain 2 years ago with a throwaway sentence about James's methodology, attended that meeting from a desk near the window. Afterward, they came to Morgan's workspace, which had recently been reorganized to occupy a larger, better-lit corner, and said, "I read the article. I'm sorry I didn't know." "You couldn't have known," Morgan said. "The record didn't show it." "It shows it now," Reyes said. Morgan thought about that, about the phrase, "the record didn't show it," as the mechanism of the whole thing, about how much of a person's reality depends on what the record chooses to hold, about the 7 years of arriving first and leaving last, of writing the documents that others signed, of solving the problems before anyone knew there was a problem. About how none of that had disappeared. It had existed, fully, whether or not the record reflected it. But the record's failure to show it had been, for 7 years, its own kind of erasure. And now, the record showed it. Not because Morgan had shouted it, or demanded it, or escalated to a version of events that forced a confrontation, but because the evidence had been allowed to accumulate. Because the documents had been kept. Because the dates were real, and the drafts were real, and the timestamps were real. And none of that had required anyone to believe anything on faith. The truth didn't need protection. It needed time and a careful enough keeper. Morgan packed up the workspace that afternoon, not to leave, but to move to the new corner, which had better light, and faced a window with a view of the building where something was faintly, perpetually blooming. On the way out of the old corner, Morgan passed the coffee station. The succulent by the window had grown considerably since the first day. Someone had repotted it. It was larger now, unhurried, entirely certain of itself. The coffee was fresh. Morgan poured a cup, stood at the window for a moment, and thought about Corinne's phrase. the work finding its way home. It was a strange phrase because home implied a fixed location, a place that had been there all along, waiting. Morgan was not sure that was exactly right. The work hadn't gone home. The work had never left. What had happened was that the world had finally caught up with where the work had always been. That was a different thing. That was, in fact, the only thing. Outside, the city continued in its unhurried, self-certain way. A delivery truck, a pigeon. The specific color of morning light on buildings that had been standing long before anyone in them arrived, and would stand long after. The coffee was very good. Morgan turned away from the window, walked to the new corner, and began. This has been a work of fiction created for entertainment purposes. Names, characters, businesses, places, and incidents are products of imagination and do not represent any real persons or events.